The snow was falling so thick, it felt like riding through television static. But the unmistakable, tiny shape in the freezing ditch forced the heavy Harley-Davidson to a screeching, dangerous halt. It wasn't a discarded jacket. It was a child beaten, half-frozen, and thrown away like garbage on the holiest night of the year. Society sees the leather, the tattoos, the Hells Angels' death head patch, and they think they know who the dangerous men are. But the real monsters hide behind manicured lawns and locked doors, thinking nobody is watching. They were wrong. On this Christmas Eve, the Devil's Riders were watching, and hell was coming with them. The wind howling through the snow-qualmy pass was brutal enough to snap tree branches, but Richard, Iron Rick Gallagher, barely felt it. At 45, with a sprawling beard laced with frost and a leather cut bearing the notorious winged death head of the Hells Angels, Rick was a man forged by harsh climates and harsher realities. It was December 24th, 11:30 p.m. Most of Washington state was tucked into warm beds waiting for morning. Rick was just trying to get his custom Harley panhead back to the Spokane clubhouse after a mandatory run to Seattle. The roads were a treacherous sheet of black ice covered by a fresh, blinding layer of powder. The headlights of his bike cut a narrow, desperate cone of yellow through the blizzard. That was when he saw it. It was just a flash of color off the shoulder of Highway 10. A jarring speck of pale pink against the endless, aggressive white of the snowbank. 99 out of 100 people would have kept driving, assuming it was a piece of blown debris. But Rick's eyes were trained to notice the things that didn't belong. He downshifted, the heavy engine roaring in protest as the tires broke traction before finally biting into the icy asphalt. He pulled over, kicking the stand down, his heavy engineer boots crunching into the knee-deep snow as he trudged toward the ditch. The pink shape began to resolve. It was a thin cotton pajama top. Rick's breath hitched in his throat. Lying in the snow, curled into a tight shivering ball, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Her bare feet were purple from the cold, and her matted blonde hair was crusted with ice and frozen blood. Jesus Christ! Rick muttered, dropping to his knees. The sheer size of him, 6 feet 4 inches and built like a brick wall, dwarfed the tiny fragile frame in the snow. He pulled off his heavy leather gauntlets and reached out. His calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he touched her cheek. It was like touching a block of ice. As he rolled her slightly onto her back to check her breathing, the full horror of her situation revealed itself beneath the glow of the distant street lamp. Her face was severely swollen. A dark, angry ring of purple and black surrounded her left eye, and her lower lip was split. Defensive bruises in the shape of adult fingertips were stamped violently into the flesh of her thin arms. She hadn't wandered out here. She had been beaten, driven out to the middle of nowhere in a blizzard, and tossed into a ditch to die. She let out a faint rattling exhale. She was alive, but barely. There was no time to call 911. Out here, an ambulance would take 45 minutes to arrive, and this child didn't have 45 minutes. Furthermore, Rick had active warrants for an old aggravated assault charge out of Oregon. If the state troopers showed up, he'd be in cuffs before he could explain himself, and the girl would be frozen solid. Without a second thought, Rick stripped off his heavy reinforced leather jacket, his club cut still attached, and wrapped the massive garment around the tiny girl. The sheepskin lining enveloped her entirely. He scooped her up. She weighed nothing. It was like holding a bundle of dry twigs. "Hold on, little bird," Rick whispered, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I got you. You're not dying out here." He carried her to the Harley, securing her between his chest and the gas tank, zipping his thick flannel shirt over her as best he could to trap his body heat. He fired up the panhead. The engine screamed into the silent, snowy night. Rick ignored the speed limits, ignored the ice, and pushed the bike to the absolute edge of disaster. He wasn't riding toward the hospital. He was riding toward the only sanctuary he knew wouldn't ask questions. The neon sign of Rusty's Auto Salvage flickered weakly through the storm on the outskirts of Spokane. Behind the scrapyard sat a heavily fortified cinder block garage. It was a known safe house for the local Hells Angels chapter, and more importantly, it was where Dr. Samuel Higgins spent his nights. Doc Higgins had lost his medical license a decade ago for writing off-the-books prescriptions, but he was the best trauma surgeon on the wrong side of the law. Rick kicked the steel door hard enough to dent it. "Doc, open the damn door!" Rick roared over the wind. Locks unfastened with a heavy clatter, and the heavy metal door swung open to reveal Doc Higgins, a thin, nervous man holding a shotgun. He lowered it instantly when he saw the towering biker, completely covered in snow, holding a leather-wrapped bundle. "Rick, what the hell are you doing riding in this?" "Clear the bench," Rick ordered, pushing past the older man into the heat of the garage. "Now, Doc, move!" Doc scrambled, sweeping carburetors and wrenches off a long metal workbench. Rick gently laid the bundle down and pulled back the heavy leather jacket. Doc gasped, taking a step back. "Good God, is that a child?" "Rick, what have you done?" "I didn't do this, you idiot!" Rick snarled, his eyes blazing with a dangerous protective fury. "I found her off Highway 10, dumped in a snowbank. She's freezing to death, and she's been beaten half to hell. Fix her." Doc's professional instincts finally overrode his shock. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket, a space heater, and a medical kit. For the next hour, the sprawling grease-stained garage functioned as an emergency room. Doc carefully elevated her body temperature, started an amphora of warm saline, and meticulously cleaned her wounds. Rick stood in the corner chain-smoking Marlboros, pacing like a caged tiger. He looked at the blood on his hands, her blood. The Hells Angels were outlaws. They smuggled, they fought, they operated entirely outside the bounds of polite society. But there was an ironclad unwritten rule in the biker code. You do not touch women, and you never, ever harm a child. To do so was a death sentence. "She's stabilizing," Doc finally said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Body temp is coming up. The bruises, Rick, this wasn't a one-time thing. These are in different stages of healing. Someone has been hurting her for a long time." Doc gently turned the girl's head to clean a gash near her ear, and something caught the overhead fluorescent light. "Wait. Look at this." Rick stepped forward. Tangled in the girl's matted hair, hidden beneath her collar, was a heavy, incredibly ornate gold locket on a thick chain. It didn't belong on a child wearing threadbare discount store pajamas. Doc popped the latch. Inside was a tiny faded photograph of a woman with striking green eyes holding a baby. Etched into the opposite side of the gold were the letters AW, beloved. "This is solid 24-karat gold," Doc whispered. "Custom made. I used to see pieces like this when I worked out of the private clinics in Seattle. Rick, this kid doesn't come from a trailer park. She comes from serious money." Before Rick could answer, a small terrified whimper broke the silence. The girl's eyes fluttered open. They were a piercing vivid green, exactly like the woman in the locket. She saw the unfamiliar grimy garage ceiling, then her eyes locked onto Rick. He was a terrifying sight, a giant of a man covered in tattoos with a thick beard and eyes narrowed in anger. She shrank back, letting out a sharp gasp, trying to curl into a ball despite the foreline in her arm. Rick immediately dropped to one knee, making himself as small as possible. He took off his skullcap and tossed his cigarette right away. Hey, it's okay," Rick said, his voice dropping to a soft rumbling bass. "Nobody is going to hurt you here. I promise you that. What's your name, little bird?" The girl trembled, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin. She looked at his leather jacket, the one that had saved her life, now draped over a chair. Then she looked back at his eyes. Children have an innate radar for danger, but they also have a radar for true protectors. Whatever she saw in the outlaw biker's eyes, it made her stop crying. "Hey, Abigail," she whispered, her voice raspy and broken. "Okay, Abigail, I'm Rick. Who did this to you? Who left you in the snow?" Abigail's lower lip quivered. She gripped the locket around her neck tightly. "The warden. He said I was bad. He said Christmas is only for real daughters, not stolen ones." Rick and Doc exchanged a chilling glance. "Stolen?" Rick stood up slowly. The protective instinct that had fueled his desperate ride had just transformed into something entirely different. It had become a cold, calculating rage. "Doc, keep the door locked," Rick said, grabbing his leather cut and shrugging it on. The winged death had settled onto his broad back. "Where are you going?" Doc asked nervously. "I have to make a phone call. We're going to need more guys." By 3 a.m. on Christmas morning, the Rusty's auto salvage garage was no longer quiet. The roar of a dozen heavy V-twin engines shook the snow off the roof as patched members of the Spokane Hells Angels arrived. They filed into the garage, stamping snow off their boots, a terrifying assembly of leather, denim, and muscle. At the center of the room stood Frankie Ghost Callahan, the chapter president. Ghost was a Vietnam veteran with a long, jagged scar running down the left side of his face. He was ruthless, highly intelligent, and commanded absolute loyalty. Rick stood by the workbench, briefing Ghost in low tones while Abigail slept heavily under the effects of Doc's painkillers in the small back office. "She called him the warden," Rick explained, handing Ghost the gold locket. "And she said she was stolen? Look at the injuries, Frankie. This wasn't a spanking. The bastard tried to kill her." Ghost turned the heavy gold locket over in his scarred hands. His cold eyes narrowed. "Nobody dumps a kid on our stretch of highway and lives to see New Year's. Not while I run this chapter." Ghost turned to the room of bikers, holding up the locket. "Listen up. We have a guest in the back room, 6 years old. Somebody beat her and left her to freeze on Highway 10 near the mile 42 marker. They think they got away with it because the cops are busy pulling drunks out of ditches." A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the men. Heavy chains rattled, knuckles cracked. "The cops operate by the book," Ghost continued, his voice echoing off the cinder blocks. "They need warrants. They need jurisdiction. We don't." "Rick, what did you see at the scene?" "Snow was heavy, filling in fast," Rick replied. "But before I pulled her out, I saw tire tracks on the shoulder. Wide tread, deep grooves, not a sedan. It was a heavy luxury SUV, like a Range Rover or a G-Wagon." And Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, damp piece of paper. "I found this frozen in the slush right where the passenger door would have opened. Looked like it fell out of someone's pocket when they dragged her out." Ghost took the paper. It was a receipt. The ink was heavily smeared by the snow, but a few lines were legible at the very top. "Silverleaf Fine Wines and Spirits. Date December 24, 2012. Time 21:15. Customer Sterling T. Silverleaf," muttered a biker named Dutch, a giant of a man with full sleeve tattoos. "That's down in South Hill. The ritzy part of town. Gated communities. Guys who pay off the judges we stand in front of." "Smith," Ghost said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. He looked at Rick. "You know a Thaddeus Smith?" Rick's jaw clenched. "Yeah, I know exactly who that is. Thaddeus Smith is the CEO of Smith Logistics, real estate, shipping, local politics. He's the guy pushing to have the city demolish the South Side low-income housing to build luxury condos. He plays golf with the chief of police. He also drives a black 2023 Mercedes G-Wagon," Dutch chimed in. "I know because I worked security at one of his construction sites last year before he fired half the crew to save a buck." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying speed. A wealthy, untouchable pillar of the community. A stolen child. A brutal attempt to dispose of evidence on a night when a blizzard would bury the body until spring. "He thinks his money makes him invisible," Rick said, sliding a heavy Colt M1911 pistol from his waistband, checking the magazine, and slamming it back home with a sharp, metallic clack. "Let's go show him he's not." "Hold on, Iron Rick," Ghost said, putting a hand on Rick's chest. "We don't just kick down the door of a billionaire on Christmas morning. The cops will bring down the National Guard on us. If we do this, we do it the Angel's way. We ghost him. We take him apart piece by piece, and we find out where this girl really came from." Ghost turned to the rest of the club. "Dutch, you take 3 guys. Go to Smith's estate in South Hill. I don't care about the gates. Get eyes on the property. Check the garage for that G-Wagon and see if the tires match. Don't engage. Just watch. Rick, you and I are going to pay a visit to a friend of ours at the DMV. We need to know who AW is, and we need to know what Thaddeus Smith is hiding. As the club mobilized, a sharp gasp came from the back office doorway. Rick turned. Abigail was standing there, wrapped in the oversized wool blanket, her bare feet on the cold concrete. She looked at the room full of giant, intimidating men armed with chains and guns. But instead of running away, she walked straight toward Rick. She reached out and grabbed two of his thick, tattooed fingers with her tiny, bruised hand. "Are you going to get the warden?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Rick knelt down, looking her dead in the eye. "Yeah, Abigail, we're going to get him. And he is never ever going to hurt you again." The little girl nodded slowly. "Good, because he's not my daddy. My daddy's name was Arthur." "Wait. No." She frowned, rubbing her head. "My real daddy was someone else. The warden locked my real mommy in a hospital." The room went dead silent. The twist hit Rick like a physical blow. Thaddeus Smith hadn't just stolen a child. He was orchestrating something massive, something sinister, and he was hiding it behind the walls of his sprawling estate. Rick stood up, looking at Ghost. There was no hesitation left in the room. The Hells Angels weren't just going to hurt Thaddeus Smith. They were going to dismantle his entire life. "Mount up," Ghost ordered, his voice cold as the ice outside. "Let's go hunt." The storm raged on, burying Spokane under an unyielding blanket of white. But the cold was nothing compared to the ice running through the veins of the men gathered at Rusty's Auto Salvage. Across town, Dutch and his three-man recon crew, Bones, a former Marine recon sniper, and two massive enforcers known as Jackson Bear, had reached the perimeter of Thaddeus Smith's South Hill estate. It was a sprawling, 10,000-square-foot monstrosity of glass and steel, heavily fortified by 10-foot wrought iron gates and surveillance cameras. Dutch lay flat on the snowy ridge overlooking the property, peering through a set of thermal binoculars. "Ghost, I got eyes on the prize," Dutch growled into his encrypted heavy-duty radio. "The main gate is locked down, but the security detail looks thin. Probably sent most of them home for the holiday. And Ghost, the detached garage is open. There's a black G-Wagon parked inside." "Tires," Ghost's voice crackled back, sharp and authoritative. "Bear's moving in to check now," Dutch replied. Down below, Bear, moving with surprising silence for a man who weighed 300 pounds, slipped over the stone perimeter wall. He crept through the manicured, snow-covered gardens, bypassing the cameras with the practiced ease of a career criminal. He slipped into the heated garage. 2 minutes later, his voice came over the radio. "Tread matches the tracks Rick described," Bear whispered. "But that ain't all. The passenger side door is open. There's a pink kid's sneaker on the floorboard and a wool blanket tossed in the corner. Blanket's got fresh blood on it. He didn't even bother to clean it up yet. Guy thinks he's untouchable." Back at the salvage yard, Ghost slammed his fist onto the workbench, the metallic bang echoing through the cavernous room. "He's dead. The man is a walking corpse." "Not yet," Rick interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He had just gotten off a burner phone with a contact deep within the county records department, a greasy, chain-smoking fixer named Jimmy Malone, who owed the club his life. "We need the whole picture before we tear his head off." Rick turned to the room. Jimmy came through. The initials AW on the locket, they stand for Audrey Wentworth. The Wentworths were old money. Shipping, timber, real estate. Audrey was the sole heir to a trust fund worth upwards of $200 million. 5 years ago, Count Thaddeus Smith swooped in and married her. Doc Higgins looked up from washing his hands. "Wait, I remember reading about that in the society pages. But didn't Audrey Wentworth suffer a severe mental breakdown?" "That's what Smith told the courts." Rick snarled. According to Jimmy, 2 years ago, Smith had a private, heavily paid judge declare Audrey completely mentally incompetent. He claimed she was a danger to herself and her child. He was granted full power of attorney and control over the Wentworth Trust. Then, he locked her away in the Pine Haven Institute, a private psychiatric facility up in the mountains near Coeur d'Alene. The room went deathly quiet as the sheer scale of the evil began to sink in. The trust has a stipulation. Ghost realized, his eyes narrowing. If Audrey dies, the money goes to her direct bloodline. It goes to Abigail. Exactly, Rick said, looking back toward the office where the little girl slept. But as long as Abigail is alive, Smith can't fully liquidate the assets. He just manages them. But if Audrey is locked away forever and Abigail tragically wanders off into a blizzard and freezes to death, Smith inherits it all. Ghost finished. $200 million. He beat a 6-year-old girl and threw her into a ditch for money. The collective rage of the Hells Angels chapter was a physical force in the room. Men gripped their heavy steel chains. Others checked the actions of their firearms. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was a war against a man who used his wealth and influence to destroy a family. Here is the play, Ghost commanded, stepping into the center of the room. The undisputed leader of the chapter was in full general mode. Smith owns the local police chief. If we call the cops, he stalls them, destroys the evidence, and we get arrested for trespassing. If we kill him, it's a murder charge and the state puts Abigail in the foster system. We don't just take his life. We take his power. We take his freedom. Ghost began assigning targets. Dutch, you and your crew hold position at the estate. Nobody leaves. If Smith tries to run, put a bullet in the engine block of that G-Wagon. With pleasure, Dutch's voice crackled over the radio. Jax, Bear, take 5 men and ride to Idaho. Hit the Pine Haven Institute. It's a rich man's prison, which means the guards are rent-a-cops. Kick the doors in, find Audrey Wentworth, and get her the hell out of there. Bring her to the safe house. What about Smith? Rick asked, stepping forward, his massive hands balled into fists. The image of Abigail's bruised face was permanently burned into his retinas. Ghost looked at Rick, seeing the unadulterated fury in his brother's eyes. Smith is ours, you, me, and Bones. We're going to walk right through his front door and have a little chat about the spirit of Christmas. By 4:30 a.m., the blizzard had broken, leaving a deadly silent freeze in its wake. The heavy iron gates of the Pine Haven Institute stood imposing against the dark mountain pines. The private psychiatric hospital looked more like a Gothic fortress built to keep secrets buried under the guise of medical treatment. The silence was shattered by the deafening roar of 6 Harley-Davidsons tearing up the mountain road. Jax and Bear didn't bother with the intercom. Bear, riding a heavily modified electric glide, slammed his bike directly into the reinforced steel of the pedestrian gate, the heavy iron giving way with a metallic scream. The bikers flooded the courtyard. 2 security guards rushed out of the main entrance, shining flashlights and shouting orders, their hands hovering over their holstered tasers. Halt! This is private property! One guard yelled, his voice trembling as he realized he was facing half a dozen fully patched Hells Angels. Jax, a towering man with a thick neck and a face covered in prison ink, walked right up to the guard, grabbed him by the tactical vest, and lifted him off his feet. We're here for visiting hours. What room is Audrey Wentworth in? I can't. Patient confidentiality. The guard stammered. Jax dropped him and pulled a massive Bowie knife from his boot, slamming the blade into the wooden reception desk. Room. Now. 3rd floor, room 304, the secure ward. The guard shrieked. The Angels moved like a paramilitary unit. They bypassed the elevators, storming up the stairwells. When they reached the 3rd floor, they found the secure doors locked via keypad. Bear simply took a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and smashed the electronic lock until the door gave way. They found room 304. Inside, sitting on a cot and staring blankly at the wall, was a frail woman with striking green eyes. She looked older than the picture in the locket, her face hollowed out by heavy sedatives and 2 years of despair. Audrey? Jax asked, his rough voice dropping to an uncharacteristic whisper. The woman slowly turned her head. She looked at the giant, terrifying men covered in leather and patches. Are you the warden's men? Are you here to finish it? Jack stepped into the room and took off his leather gloves. No, ma'am. We ain't with Smith. We're with Abigail, and she wants her mama. At the sound of her daughter's name, a spark of life ignited in Audrey's deadened eyes. The heavy fog of the sedative seemed to instantly break. She let out a ragged, desperate sob. Let's go home, Audrey, Jack said, gently wrapping his heavy leather coat around her frail shoulders. The devil's riding with you tonight. Simultaneously, 40 miles away in Spokane, Thaddeus Smith was pouring himself a glass of $200 scotch in his sprawling, mahogany-lined study. He wore a silk robe, standing by a roaring fireplace. He felt a deep, twisted sense of accomplishment. The deed was done. The problem was handled. By morning, the snowplows would push the evidence deep into the ditch, and by spring, nobody would care. His self-congratulation was interrupted by the sound of his front door exploding inward off its hinges. Smith dropped his crystal glass. It shattered on the Persian rug. He rushed to his desk, pulling open the drawer to grab his silver-plated revolver. Before his fingers could touch the grip, a massive, heavy-booted foot kicked the drawer shut, nearly snapping Smith's wrist. Rick Gallagher, stood over the billionaire, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying violence. Ghost and Bones stood flanking the doorway, holding shotguns at the ready. Thaddeus Smith, Ghost said calmly, stepping into the study. He admired the expensive artwork on the walls. Nice place. Shame what's about to happen to it. Smith backed up against the wall, his face pale, his arrogance entirely evaporating in the presence of real, unfiltered danger. Who the hell are you people? Do you know who I am? I'll have the police here in 2 minutes. I play golf with the chief. We know exactly who you are, Tommy. Rick growled, stepping closer, his massive frame trapping the billionaire in the corner. You're the coward who beats little girls and leaves them to freeze in the snow. Smith's eyes widened in sheer panic. I don't know what you're talking about. Rick's hand shot out with blinding speed. He grabbed Smith by the throat of his silk robe and lifted the man off the ground, slamming him hard against the mahogany bookshelves. Heavy, leather-bound volumes rained down on them. She has green eyes, Tommy, Rick whispered, his face mere inches from Smith's, and a gold locket. She's safe, and she told us everything. About the warden. About her mother. You can't prove anything. Smith choked out, clawing desperately at Rick's massive, tattooed forearm. It's my word against a bunch of outlaw trash. Ghost chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. He walked over to Smith's desk, pulled out a thick, encrypted laptop, and handed it to Bones. Bones here used to do intelligence work for the military before the government decided he was too violent. He's already mirroring your hard drives, your offshore accounts, your payments to the judge, the bribes to the medical staff at Pine Haven. It's all ours now. Rick threw Smith to the floor. The billionaire landed hard, gasping for air, clutching his throat. Here is what happens now, Tommy, Ghost said, pulling a digital recorder from his leather cut. You are going to confess to everything. The fraud, the bribery, the false imprisonment of Audrey Wentworth, and the attempted murder of Abigail. Every single detail. I won't say a damn word. Smith spat, trying to regain some semblance of his false bravery. My lawyers will destroy you. Rick didn't say a word. He simply reached down, grabbed Smith by the ankle, and dragged the screaming billionaire out of the study, down the grand hallway, and out the shattered front door. Rick dragged him into the freezing, snow-covered driveway. He tossed Smith into a deep snowbank, exactly like the one he had left Abigail in. Smith shrieked as the freezing snow instantly soaked his silk robe, chilling him to the bone. Cold, ain't it? Rick said, kneeling beside the shivering, terrified man. Imagine being 6 years old, beaten, bleeding, wondering why your daddy doesn't love you. That's what you did. Rick pulled out his Colt M1911 and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against Smith's forehead. You have 2 choices, Rick said, his voice completely devoid of mercy. Option 1, I leave you out here in the snow, broken and bleeding, just like you left her. and I watch you freeze. Option 2, you talk into Ghost's recorder, and we hand you over to the feds. The feds? Smith gasped, his teeth chattering violently. We don't deal with local cops, Ghost said, stepping out onto the porch. I made a call to a Special Agent Harris at the FBI field office in Seattle. He's been looking into your business practices for a year. He's sending a tactical team right now. They'd love a recorded confession to secure a life sentence in federal lockup. Smith looked at the gun against his head, then at the freezing snow surrounding him, and finally into the merciless eyes of the biker. He broke. The billionaire sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound. Okay, I'll say it. I did it. I paid the judge. I took her out to the highway. Please, just let me inside. Ghost hit record. Start from the beginning, Tommy. Christmas morning dawned bright and bitterly cold over Spokane. The sun reflected off the pristine snow, a stark contrast to the darkness of the night before. Inside the fortified garage of Rusty's Auto Salvage, the heavy metal door opened. Jax walked in, leading a bewildered, exhausted Audrey Wentworth. Doc Higgins had moved Abigail to a small, clean cot in the heated office. The little girl was awake, sipping warm broth from a mug, wearing an oversized, clean Harley-Davidson t-shirt that hung on her like a dress. Audrey stopped in the doorway. She dropped to her knees, the heavy biker coat falling from her shoulders. Abby? She whispered, her voice cracking. Abigail's eyes went wide. She dropped the mug. Mommy. The little girl scrambled off the cot, ignoring the pain of her bruises, and threw herself into her mother's arms. The two of them held onto each other, weeping uncontrollably on the concrete floor. Audrey kissed her daughter's bruised face, rocking her back and forth, repeating her name like a prayer. Outside the office, the toughest, most dangerous men in Washington state stood in absolute silence. Some of them looked away, others aggressively wiped at their eyes, pretending it was just dust from the garage. Rick stood by the workbench, his arms crossed over his massive chest, watching the reunion. He felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. It was Ghost. You did good, Iron Rick, the president said quietly. You saved them both. Smith? Rick asked, not taking his eyes off the mother and daughter. Agent Harris has him in custody. Ghost replied. The feds raided his office, froze his assets, and arrested the judge who signed the fake competency order. With the confession and the computer drive's bones pulled, Smith is going to rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. And the Wentworth Trust goes back to Audrey. Rick nodded slowly. The rage that had fueled him through the freezing night had finally burned out, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. He had broken the law 1,000 times in his life, but on this night, he was exactly what the world needed him to be. Later that afternoon, as Doc Higgins arranged for Audrey and Abigail to be safely transported to a secure, private hospital in Seattle under FBI protection, Abigail stopped at the heavy steel door of the garage. She turned around and walked back to Rick, who was wiping grease off his panhead. She reached up and tugged on his heavy leather cut. Rick knelt down, bringing himself eye level with the little girl. Thank you, Rick, she said softly. Then, she leaned forward and kissed the outlaw biker on his rough, bearded cheek. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, bent silver star, a cheap ornament she must have found on the garage floor. She pressed it into Rick's massive hand. Merry Christmas. Rick looked at the cheap piece of tin in his palm. To him, it was worth more than all the gold in Thaddeus Smith's vaults. He closed his fist around it and gave her a rare, genuine smile. Merry Christmas, little bird. You fly safe now. As the car pulled away, taking the mother and daughter toward a new, safe life, Rick walked back to his motorcycle. He zipped up his leather jacket, the winged death's head proudly displayed on his back. He fired up the heavy engine, the roar echoing through the salvage yard. The Hells Angels rode out into the crisp winter morning, disappearing down the highway, returning to the shadows from which they came outlaws to the world, but guardian angels to a little girl in the snow. What began as a desperate rescue in the freezing snow became a massive, underground manhunt. The men society labeled as dangerous outlaws ended up becoming the ultimate protectors, risking their freedom and their lives to dismantle a wealthy abuser's empire and reunite a stolen girl with her true family. It proves that true heroes don't always wear capes or badges. Sometimes they ride on two wheels, wear leather, and live by a code that demands justice for the innocent. If this incredible, true-to-life story of vigilante justice, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Your support helps us tell more stories of unsung heroes. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another gripping drama just like it. Drop a comment below. Did you expect the angels to take down a billionaire empire? Tell us your favorite part of the story.